Hey, good morning, everyone. 早上好. Welcome to summer in DC, right? So make up for what will be 90 plus degrees outside. We're chilling you down here, all right? My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum. I've been here about 18 years now. Woohoo! And the China Environment Forum started 20 years ago, and we over this time period, we haven't been sitting on our heels here. We put on meetings, do exchanges, lots of publications. Increasingly, our pubs are going online. So if you're new to the China Environment Forum, make sure and you want to know where to find our online written stuff. Just talk to us afterwards. We focus a lot on clean energy issues, particularly U.S.-China clean energy cooperation. Also, water energy nexus under our Choke Point project. Food safety is another topic that we're going to be doing a lot more of in recent years. But today we're going to hunker down today, and we're going to focus on clean energy, on a topic that I know we've got more people filtering in, the power sector in China. Now a lot of you know that right now in China there's a big priority by the government to get those skies blue again. And so one issue, in March 2017 at the National People's Congress, Li Keqiang, he promised that the government was going to accelerate coal-fired power and integrate more renewables into the power grid. And in 2008, coal-fired power plants have actually declined in their production, and wind and solar are on the rise. But a lot of you here who are China environment experts, you know that renewables are having increasing difficulties actually getting on the grid. So that's one of the issues that we are going to be talking about today, because the Chinese government is concerned about pollution control, and one of the big solutions is going to be we got to get it right on the grid. And so to do that, I've invited 3 people here today who are much wiser and much more fluent on grids than I am, and they're going to talk about what can't possibly be done in China to move towards a more market-oriented electricity system, so that there's going to be less pollution, and also in ways to improve water quality. Those of you who might be familiar with our Choke Point work that focuses on not only coal's water footprint in China, but also some of the pollution that comes from the coal sector, could know why I asked my speakers, at least a couple of them, to talk about water. We're going to start off with Mun Ho, who works at the Harvard China Project, and he's a visiting scholar at RFF. You've got his bio here, but he's done lots of stuff on clean air in China. A passion, I would agree, right, Mun Ho? Yes. So he's going to start us off talking about give you a little bit of history. Don't be bored, because it's really important to know how can China's grid go forward. We have to look at some of the challenges in the past. And then, kind of like as a relay race, he's going to pass the baton on to Chris James, who works at the Regulatory Assistance Project. And you've been there for about 15 years now, right? 9. Why do I think 15? I don't know. It's a random number. It just kind of popped in my head. So about 9 years, and he spends about 12 to 16 weeks a year in China. RAP has been focused a lot on the modeling and some of the policies that China needs to bring their grid into the modern age. And so he's going to talk about the potential solutions to promote clean electricity dispatch in China. Now, a lot of you, I'm going to guess, Eleanor, you're going to agree with me, that a lot of people in the States probably do not know that the U.S. has gone through similar challenges with our grids, right? We don't have the same electricity scale and hunger for power as China does, but we have had grid problems. I think people in New York with that big outage a few years ago, DC, we've been pretty lucky. But so today I have Eleanor Stein, who she used to serve as an administrative law judge in the New York State Public Service Commission. And most recently, she was a project manager for the Commission's Reforming the Energy Vision initiative in New York, which was about reforming the grid. Now, she was just talking to me that she retired last year from that job, and in her retirement, she's now taken 5 other jobs. She's teaching climate change law up at Albany Law. She's a board member at Rocky Mountain Institute. We've had them here before talking about their Reinventing Fire project, and she's got other stuff that she can talk to you about. But she's going to tell us the story about REV, about what happened in New York, about how some of the challenges that they've had in reforming their grid, and kind of talk about whether the principles and the concepts that they used up in REV could be applicable to China. All right? And your job as attentive audience members, keep drinking your coffee and be ready for some challenging questions, because these people can handle it. All right? You guys set? Yeah, I need some enthusiasm coming from the audience. This is the power grid, so I want power in the audience. All right, so Mun Ho, come on up here. Little applause to kind of wake everyone's brains up.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.
Remember to speak in the mic.
Okay.
Oh, and you left your clicker. Can you pass the clicker?
I'm just learning about this topic of electricity, so there are many people in this room that will know more about this. I've spent the last more than 20 years at the Harvard-China project working on air pollution issues, environmental and energy policies. And Jennifer invited me, I guess, in part because a colleague and I at RFF just finished a paper describing the recent history of the Chinese electricity sector to set up the reader to understand the current proposed reform. So our idea is that to understand how the reform can proceed and what are the possible challenges and difficulties, we should understand this history. So in the next 15 minutes or so, I hope to summarize that history. So Jennifer told me to tell stories. I'm a lousy storyteller. So I will just repeat. I will repeat the 3 stories from the newspapers. The first one is about the Earthon Incident. I actually didn't get a newspaper. So this is the biggest hydropower plant. I mean, it was finished and started generating power in 1999. And immediately we ran into something that is now called the Earthon Incident. There's always an incident in China.
Did it have a number with it too?
No. So what happened was this wonderful, free, clean, renewable energy was told to stop generating because they need to keep the coal plants burning. So this really shocked the authorities that they have such an inefficient system that this marvelous clean power could not be used. And 3 years after that, the first major reform was proclaimed in 2002. The second headline is from this China Dialogue article from a couple of months ago. China takes another step to reduce coal-fired power, and the subheadline is, as China restricts coal further, research finds that $1 trillion of coal power assets could be stranded. So what is happening, I think most of you know now, is that there is a major excess capacity in coal electricity. And this happened because I think a couple of years ago, or 3 years ago, the authorities tried to change things by decentralizing the investment authority to the provinces. And as a result of this uncoordinated investment, there is this huge overcapacity. And Beijing finally realized that they have to re-centralize back the authority. And so what this article was about, there's this German research institute that estimates that about maybe $500 billion of these assets would never be used, at least not anytime soon, and it could be completely wasted. So China's GDP is about $12 trillion, I guess, roughly today. So it is not a horrible mistake, but it's a bad enough mistake. The third story is about steel. It's from the Financial Times, just last month, I guess. China accused of undermining drive to cut steel capacity. I came across this article in writing an article about air pollution. This is an article that ended up in the Fortune magazine webpage in English and Chinese. We discuss why the pollution problem in China is so difficult to solve when China could do so many wonderful things, like going to the moon and building all these wonderful bridges. But pollution is such an intractable problem, and in particular in Beijing. So China has succeeded in reducing the average amount of pollution and the average air quality quite substantially. But the headlines in the newspaper show that there is pollution spikes that for many days there's a very, very severe pollution. And in the case of Beijing, part of the problem is there are no longer any coal plants inside Beijing, coal power plants. That Beijing is surrounded by Hebei province. And Hebei province produces more steel than all of the United States. So China has a big steel capacity, excess capacity, and the government wants to cut it. But this particular newspaper article is about how it is not really succeeding, that the plants that were closed reopened, and throughout this period where they say we have great success in cutting capacity, the actual capacity has been steadily rising. So what I want to illustrate with this story is that reducing air pollution is a top priority for the government today. As he noted, Jennifer noted in the Communist Party speeches. Reducing steel capacity is a priority. And yet both of these high priorities did not result in a success in reducing steel output and pollution. And I would attribute this to the political economy of this situation, that the provinces have great political autonomy to make decisions, in particular economic decisions. And although the central government would like these things to happen, reduce coal use, reduce capacity, the final decisions is left at the provincial level. And what are the provincial priorities? The party boss priority is to stay in power and to be promoted. And historically, the promotion is based on a simple GDP. The faster you grow, subject to the fact that you don't have riots in your province, then that's the criteria. And also for their own purposes, building their own power plants and their own steel plants is a source of revenue and a source of employment. Closing the steel plants, closing the power plants means finding jobs for the workers. And that is, I would say, is the major stumbling block to these lack of successes. So let me give you a quick run through of the history. So, can you look at it here? Yeah. Then I can see. This is a table taken from the paper, a much bigger table. So prior to 1985, the Ministry of Electricity owns and runs everything. In that case, they would not have this Earthon Incident, right? Somebody would have made a decision, but to shut down the coal. But that centralized authority resulted in too little money and too little electricity. And so they allowed independent companies to generate power, including foreign companies. And that started what is eventually became this fair dispatch system about how to decide who gets to sell power. In the beginning, since there were shortages, it was not an issue. Everybody could sell whatever they could generate. But over time, by the end of the 90s, there was excess power. And so this became an issue. And they came up with the formula that the San Gong formula that I translated to transparent, fair, and impartial, which means that any generator in a given class was given an equal share of hours of the total demand. So the emphasis is on fairness. There's no mention of efficiency and environmental consequences. And that is the system that prevails to this day. So the first reform in 2002 tried to relax some of this central control and introduce direct contracts. So I will talk about this in the next few slides. The 2006 to 2010 was a period of the 11th five-year plan in which for the first time the environmental regulations were seriously enforced. And that environmental effort resulted in two innovations to the electricity sector: the energy conservation dispatch and the emission generation rights trading. So I will talk about that in the next few minutes. All these experiments in reform resulted in a lot of abusive practices by the now deregulated grid company. And so by 2011, the NDRC, the planning agency, have to reassert its price-setting powers. And so this is where we are today. In 2015, a major document, the start of a reform effort to bring in a more rational system, trying to harness the markets. And that's the topic for the rest of the morning. So let me then give you some specific examples about how difficult it was to reform in this past 15 years. So they tried to introduce a system where the big generators and the big consumers could negotiate themselves outside of the central plan prices. And the provincial governments were happy to use it so that they would result in lower prices for the big electricity users. But generators would have very little incentive to participate because they were guaranteed of the plan price and they were guaranteed hours under this dispatch formula. So the only reason why a generator would want to participate is that they can sell more than the allocated hours. But if they sell more than the allocated hours, those who are not allowed to participate became very unhappy. And so this system was, there was a big conflict, and it didn't really do very much. As you can see in this table, this is the 100% of the total electricity.
It's a webcast. You got to talk here.
Okay.
Sorry. Unless you can yell really loud.
Okay. So the top line is the allocation by the plan is 80 hours. All these contracts is a minor share. So the reform has some changes at the edges, but the bulk of it is still according to this formula. So as I say, the 11th five-year plan really closed down some of these old plans and introduced the FGD regulations. And this is the two innovations. So let me talk about them. The small plants were required to shut down, but they were given in compensation the rights to generate. So for 3 years, they can sell sort of the right to make profits that they would have gotten if they kept on generating. And so this introduced some improvement in efficiency. They did shut down and they sold the rights to the more efficient plants. But it was not a complete success because the emission control cost was not fully compensated, and the big grid company started bullying the process and charging high transmission fees. So there were these kind of institutional obstacles to, and essentially a good market idea to improve efficiency. Then they say, okay, if we can't let the market do it, let's have this rule. So they say, we're going to have this energy conservation dispatch where provincial governments have to set down the order in which the plant should be run. So they say wind and solar must go first, hydro second, nuclear third, combined heat and power next, and then the coal. And within the coal, they have to rank each plant by how energy efficient it is and how much pollution control they have. So they started this with 8 pilot provinces. And it soon ran into big difficulties, right? So the formula means a breaking of this ancient, not ancient, for a long time, this fair dispatch formula, right? And so the ones that lost out are not these tiny companies, right? So after the reform, the ministry was broken up into very 5 big generating companies and a few smaller ones. And the units that were put to the bottom of the list were not happy, right? And the difficulty was so great that 3 provinces just gave up on this pilot and say, we have to go back to this old, simple, fair dispatch formula. And this happened, we are talking about just not so many years ago, right? Before the
2007.
Yeah, that was the period. So, so this is the main story in this report that we just put up on the RFF webpage, a long history of this reform era in order to understand the challenges going forward. So again, the bottom line is that because of the great autonomy given to provincial authorities, and because the authorities' main concern is maintaining employment and tax revenues, they're very resistant to central government directives to import more power, right? It's more rational for Shanghai to import electricity from the renewable sources, for Guangdong to import more from Yunnan. But they have their own interests, right? The Shanghai government owns coal power plants, and they're resistant to using them less. There is also, for those who do not want to read the long paper, there's also a blog post. And for those who are interested in the air pollution nexus to this issue, again, the same political economy problem, that is the first article. So for those who are interested in the further reading, I just discovered this book published a few months ago by an Australian professor, and that gives a good history of the Chinese power system. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that the issue of jobs and electricity, we've heard this conversation here in the U.S., right? Chris, I'll get your PowerPoint up.
Yep. All right, good morning. Okay, good morning. I am now working full-time on China. Some of you may remember that I also worked on United States air and energy policy, but just starting this year, my focus is solely on China. So that has enabled me to expand not only into the air quality, but also deepen background on power sector. So I want to thank Jennifer for organizing this morning, and it's a really timely topic. So I'm looking forward to your questions. One of the popular news stories that everybody has seen in outlets like the Wall Street Journal or New York Times is that China's building a lot of power plants, and there's quotes, they're building one a month or one a week, and the rate isn't so much, but this is sort of a common theme in Western media. And indeed, as Mun Ho pointed out, China is building and has built a lot of power plants. The issue is they're not using them. And there are a lot of factors as to why this exists. One is that 10 years ago, you had an electricity growth rate that was 10 to 15% per year. You had very high GDP growth. Well, if you're an energy system planner or an electric planner, your goal is to keep the lights on so the beer stays cold and people have hot showers. And if you're looking at continued growth and you don't have the capacity, then your first move is going to be to continue to build more power plants. But as we've seen, China's GDP growth has been slowed on purpose, now down to about 7%. But a larger factor is that the contributors to GDP have changed so that it's no longer just the primary iron and steel, paper and so forth, but China's economy is diversifying. The bicycle helmet that I have in my messenger bag was made in China by Smith. Smith is an Idaho company that you probably all know make very expensive ski equipment too. And that diversification means that China can have an equal or greater GDP by burning less coal. So that has been another factor that we've seen to not requiring as much coal to produce GDP. There's also, when you're transitioning your economy from sort of a primary industry, facilities running 24/7, to the service economy, not only manufacturing, but also tourism and so forth, your electricity use tends to be peakier in one shift or two shifts. And that means that your demand is also changing so that instead of sort of a steady demand over 24 hours, you're going to have peaks and troughs during the day. So building an electricity system that's comprised of very large, what people at RMI often call brittle power systems, means that you don't necessarily have your resources matched with the demand. And What we really need to see is a move towards sort of a smaller, more distributed system and a more efficient use of the existing plants they have. A second issue that has received a lot of attention is in terms of the renewable energy development. As we know, China's vast development of wind and solar has contributed to decrease in costs over the last several years. We've seen wind and solar costs decrease by 50 to 70%. That is a global phenomenon. Germany has also been of help, but many of us now in the United States have solar panels on our house, and the economies work. You have a much, the rate of return is now much more attractive to consumers. The issue in China is the wind and solar are continuing to get built, but like the large power plant example that I had before, they're not being used. We're seeing very high rates of wind and solar curtailment, particularly in Western China, rates that are, sometimes I think we're at 30% per month in some provinces like Gansu and Inner Mongolia. There are environmental consequences to this. Each megawatt hour of wind or solar that is not used is burning an extra 2.4 tons of coal equivalent. That's a World Bank number that they use. So if you take the numbers that are on the screen in front of you, which are in gigawatts, in gigawatt hours, and multiply that by 2.4 tons per megawatt hour, you can see that there is a really missing a chance to reduce coal consumption and use those resources more effectively. A second reason behind these high rates of curtailment goes back to part of the discussion that Mun Ho had in terms of economic development. The electricity balancing areas in China are basically within a provincial boundary. So what does that mean? If you're an electricity grid operator in the United States, for example, or in Europe, you have the ability to rely on the resources not only in your own state, but also in adjacent states, so that if there's a thunderstorm or it's really hot, or if you have an earthquake or hurricane or whatever, you have the ability to draw upon resources from outside your jurisdiction. Another reason to consider larger balancing areas could be that you have a major unexplained outage. You have a power plant that suddenly goes offline in your state, and you need to rely on resources from another state. China right now does not do that. So its balancing areas remain within provincial boundaries, which means that in order to keep the lights on, you have to have a much greater reserve capacity than you would otherwise require. So you have a lot of resources that are, iron and steel on the ground per se, that are not being used because of this lack of a planning capacity to use these resources from other balancing areas. We've had a lot of success in Europe and the US from better integrating of wind. Denmark, for example, in the 1970s and 80s, used to have very high wind curtailment. Texas did too. And we've seen over the past 20 years, in both Denmark and Texas, the wind curtailment rates are down less than 0.5%. And Earthon in Texas is probably one of the best managed grids in the world. They're able to have a reserve margin that is at times less than 5%, which many grid operators would say is crazy, but they have their wind forecasting synced with knowledge of how these resources are going to operate. And that is a lesson that China could also use. On the air pollution side, we know there's been a lot of attention to improving air quality. And indeed, we have seen improvement in Jing-Jin-Ji. The levels are down. We've seen Shenzhen demonstrate compliance as the first city to meet China's grade 1 standard. So there's been tremendous progress. However, we've seen also that the number of hazardous pollution days is still unacceptable. And particularly in the fall and winter, which synchronize with the heating season, as you've seen. These are 2016 data from Beijing. China has had success in cleaning the air on an episodic basis. We all are familiar with the APEC blue skies that cost, like according to some accounts, $12 billion to produce blue skies for the APEC event a few years ago. So China knows the number of tons that it needs to take out of the air in order to have blue skies. The issue is actually implementing those measures and consistently enforcing them. The Heavy Pollution Day programs, which now are coming out in Beijing and other cities, require industry and government to either shut down production or not drive, do alternative things. And there has been some success with that, but not the degree of success that the government officials hoped. And there are probably three reasons for this. One could be that the plans themselves are not as efficient as they would hope. In other words, they're expecting to get a significant rate of reduction from all these measures, but they've miscalculated on the efficacy of those measures. A second could be that we have a situation where industry is misreporting. They say they've done something and they're actually not. And then the third could be that industry is actually shutting down production, but then they're turning on their diesel generators. We saw that in the United States. I had that as a regulator in my own state of Connecticut in the 90s. I was witness to that in Chongqing when I was there in 2011, and China had then an energy consumption policy to improve the rate of consumption, and they had shut down all the industry in November and December of 2011. Well, in Chongqing, what they did, and I was there, was they just turned on all the diesel generators. Well, that, I would argue, was actually a worse outcome than running the coal plants because, as we know, diesels, especially uncontrolled diesels, have very high NOx rates, they have low stack heights, and they're in a densely populated area. So you're actually affecting a greater population, and having these awful health impacts that you could otherwise avoid. So that's an issue, I think, for the future. There's also some, I think, information in state grids electricity consumption that occurs on these heavy pollution days that deserves further research and attention. On the water quality side, China has poor water quality in many regions. 1/4 of the water in China is unfit for industrial consumption, meaning you can't even make pulp and paper out of it. We have some cities that import water just for drinking, and that's a very expensive issue, not to mention the solid waste issue from all the water bottles. On the thermal power plant side, we know that for each megawatt hour of industrial generation, the water consumption is about 13 cubic meters. China's thermal plants are responsible for about 12% of all the national water withdrawals. So these are significant water numbers. And we know that if there was better integration of wind and use of best available techniques like dry cooling or better cooling techniques, that you could reduce consumption by about 20%. So there's a lot of low-cost things that could be achieved. Another, and I think those of us that go to China a lot witness this, would be to actually use hoses to water the trees that have a nozzle on the end instead of the fire hose technique that we see often. And we also see continuing to clean streets with water in desert places like Beijing, which seems like really not a good idea to do in that situation. So looking ahead on the 13th five-year plan, which is in effect 2016 to 2020, there are a number of really good elements in this. We see a continued stressing to reduce sulfur dioxide, oxides of nitrogen, as before in the 11th and 12th five-year plan. The 13th five-year plan has added volatile organic compounds because of their relation to hazardous air pollutants and also to deal with the severe ozone pollution that plagues many Chinese cities. The 13th five-year plan also says that China cities must have 80% acceptable air quality days by 2020. That means having an air quality index that is less than or equal to 100 for 80% of the days that year. On the water side, there's a target to reduce consumption by 23% from 2015 levels. And per my earlier remark on better integration of wind and better cooling techniques, that is a very achievable target. The fourth bullet on energy consumption, that also continues a trend that we saw in the 12th and 11th five-year plan to reduce consumption. And China has had great success in doing that through its top 1,000 and top 10,000 programs that exceeded the goal of removing 250 million tons of coal consumption from industry. In fact, the actual amount achieved by the top 1,000 and top 10,000 program was something like 300 million tons. And those programs were very heavily audited and enforced. So I would argue that that's a program to look for in the future.
Can you explain just briefly? Some people might not know what the top 1,000 program was. Just
So
briefly.
both of those programs, top 1,000 and 10,000, refer to the top 1,000 and 10,000 largest energy consumers in China. So it's not only industrial facilities, it's also large commercial buildings. For example, the World Bank headquarters in Beijing was a top 10,000 facility because of its energy usage and the quantity of coal demanded to heat and cool that building. So all of these facilities were listed and identified. Each of the 26 provinces and major cities had a list of all the facilities, and there was also assigned a target, the number of tons of coal that had to be removed from that facility. Each facility was then required to conduct an energy audit and then identify all the cost-effective measures that could be achieved at that particular facility. They were then required to implement those measures, and then the auditors came in, they actually called them energy-saving troops, and inspected the facility to verify that, in fact, these savings had occurred. And then and only then did the facility receive the incentive payment for implementing those measures. So that is, in fact, I think, an example of implementation and enforcement that we would suggest be a model for future efforts. And there's often a lot of discussion that China doesn't know about implementation and enforcement, and I think that particular example shows that they do, and that's something that could be extended. The last two, the coal cap consumption at 5 billion tons, that is a hard number. And then the last one is both a challenge and an opportunity. China wants to move from the system of very kind of blunt instruments, not having markets, to allowing large energy consumers to contract directly with load-serving entities. And I want to distinguish load-serving entity from a utility. So the option here is that a large energy consumer, industrial or commercial customer, will have the ability to purchase electricity from what we would call in the United States a load-serving entity. So it's not Joe's power plant. It's the person who's aggregating that electricity from a group of power plants and then selling it to customers. And that's something that China wants to move to by 2020. There are a lot of risks to achieving these goals. There is a coal cap, but that coal cap number is 16% higher than current consumption, and that's caused a lot of head shaking, especially since we know in the last 2 years the actual quantity of coal consumed has decreased by, depending on whose numbers you're looking at, between 4 and 9%. The market-based electricity system that I mentioned could be a default merely to price, where consumers just contract directly with the older, the companies representing older coal plants that are inefficient, so you could actually exacerbate air pollution and water pollution. And then the third is, even though the air law has a requirement that the city plans, provincial plans must have clean energy, that the grid companies must have green dispatch, those elements are not yet integrated into the different air quality plans. So we've developed several recommendations to address these gaps and also try to promote integration. The first would be for the customers that want to participate in these market-based electricity purchases, that there be some sort of an environmental portfolio standard, an EPS as it's known. This is an output-based standard that would be applied, that can be applied to a fleet of plants, perhaps owned by one owner, could be applied at a provincial level, but it's basically a performance standard that says, all of these plants have to meet a certain number of, grams per megawatt hour for oxides of nitrogen, sulfur dioxide, and CO2, and that the EPS would decrease by 1 to 3% per year on some long-term trajectory, so that it is synced with meeting the air quality plans, meeting the energy intensity targets, energy consumption targets, as well as helping China to satisfy its commitment to slow and then decrease its greenhouse gas emissions. Second piece, on the dispatch side, I mentioned that the air law has an element that requires green dispatch. There are a couple of very basic things that could be done to address this issue. First would be to move at least to a strict economic dispatch instead of this equal shares generation policy that Mun Ho mentioned.
The ancient one.
The ancient one. Well, it's 10 years old, but it's ancient. In China, that's ancient. That alone would improve air quality, because the difference between the most efficient the most efficient plants in China are between 44 and 47% thermal efficiency, whereas the average is about 32%. So the most efficient plant burns 50%, up to 50% less coal per megawatt hour than the average plant. That would be a tremendous air quality improvement. The third bullet is to look at this balancing area piece and consider having balancing areas that are larger than a provincial boundary to utilize your resources more effectively, not only the thermal plants, but also the wind and solar resources. Then to get at this air quality gap and getting clean energy plans in, there are a number of things that can be done now, working with the environmental protection bureaus, the EPBs, and universities such as Tsinghua and Peking and so forth that do the modeling to assess the clean energy benefits of these the air quality benefits of these clean energy policies, and then those could be included as measures in the air quality plans. Some of the mechanisms to achieve that, I think, are fairly well established. We have the State Council 10 Measures plan that is up for renewal this year. That could be strengthened and continued. We know it's going to take 20 years for China to really get its blue skies. The air law needs to be consistently implemented and enforced, and an opportunity now is to do that through the development of the permit system that the Ministry of Environmental Protection is currently working on. This system could, for example, take those good things that I mentioned from the top 1,000 and top 10,000 program, the energy audit, and operationalize that through the permits as a requirement. And that would be a way to get at the energy consumption as well as to improve air quality. And then lastly, we know that China intends to start a carbon trading program this year. I think there are many opportunities there to look at coal control and public health benefits, not only from the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but also jointly reducing pollutants, NOx and SO2. So my last slide, if people are interested in follow-up information, that first bullet is RAP's landing page, which has a lot of information. We also have blogs there and a lot of technical papers if you're really interested in getting at this in more detail. So I want to thank you very much for your time and attention. I look forward to the questions.
Okay, thank you so much. And I want to let you know that all of the PowerPoints, they're online in PDF, so you can see these websites. And if you didn't want it online, it's too late. It's out there. All right. Did you just learn a lot, Eleanor?
I did, and the main thing I learned is that I'm going to be advocating for energy-saving troops in New York, which we definitely need.
See, it's not just a one-way street when we
Not
talk
at
U.S.
all.
China clean energy stuff. I mean, but the image of troop. Oh, do they have a special uniform? Do we know?
I'm not at liberty to say.
Okay.
So let me just start by saying that at this moment in time, I think that obviously China has a critical leading role in the global attempt to fight climate change, and the withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Agreement, which in my view is a rogue and shameful action, does place even greater onus on China. And I think that we all know that China has the capability to take that leading role and to make great gains. And I'm speaking here as someone with no expert knowledge whatsoever on China, but I would like to try to give you some of the lessons of experiments in New York, but also from the UK, from California, from Germany, and from Australia, who are doing similar projects. So just to set a context, my focus is going to be on electricity production, and in general, we're looking at a climate change crisis that's brought about largely by the combustion of fossil fuels. And of that, a very significant percentage, roughly 42% globally, is from the generation of electricity. So if we can solve the problem of decarbonizing our electric production, we can solve the problem of climate change. So in the United States, we have 85% of our electricity coming from fossil fuels. 40% of our U.S. carbon emissions comes from coal plants. And so we're looking at something called deep decarbonization. And there's a project that was begun at the United Nations called the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project. And I would recommend it to you. Have a look at their website. It has led to studies that have been done in the U.S. and other countries to actually create and examine pathways to decarbonize. And because different country systems are so different, each pathway is somewhat different. And I think China's pathway is considerably different. But it may still have at the core the decarbonization of electricity and the potential, let's say in New York or here or in the U.S., is to, if we can solve the problem of decarbonizing our electricity production, we can then basically electrify other sectors of the economy. So our transportation system, which is obviously gasoline-based and diesel-based, can be based on electric fuel. And that's a growing market here. My understanding is that electric vehicle production and use has been pretty successful in China. So that is a potential to be realized. And also electrify the heating and cooling of buildings, and electrify our home heating and cooking and all those processes, and most, very importantly, also industrial processes to the extent possible. But of course, the predicate is getting carbon out of how we produce electricity. And the urgency of this became clear to New York in October of 2012 with Superstorm Sandy, which led to a 9-day power outage that cut off 400,000 customers in Lower Manhattan, so paralyzing the stock exchange, the criminal system, the World Trade Center, city government, you name it. But strikingly, the institutions that continued to function through that outage were some community projects that had solar panels on the roofs, some demonstration projects, the hospitals that had combined heat and power systems, so they had a natural gas source and they used that to generate electricity, in the basement or hopefully maybe on the second floor, given this. And those became those are the hospitals to which people were evacuated from all the other city hospitals. So years of op-eds and studies and modeling were not as effective as 9 days of, totally visually obvious that these were the sources that could survive a major outage from the grid, and that our grid was very vulnerable to major climate events. And although you can't attribute any single weather event to climate change, certainly the odds have shifted toward events like Superstorm Sandy. So that really shifted New York State's policy on the energy system. And we had to really examine the workings of the grid, which, like the rest of the American grid, is extremely reliable under normal circumstances and relatively affordable and so on, but still is aging, needed very substantial investment over the next 10 years just to keep functioning, more or less, had these costly and highly polluting plants that were only used at the periods of the greatest use, therefore maybe 100 hours a year or maybe less, had growing customer demand by people who wanted to take control over their use of energy the way consumers have taken control over the rest of our decisions. I should have brought my iPhone with me, but I usually hold it up at this point saying, you buy everything on this, you make all your consumer decisions on this, but you can't make any decisions about your use of energy, although now you can run your thermostat from it. So that's a start, but that's a little example of what could be our energy system in the future. Electric utilities are notoriously backward when it comes to using 21st century information technology, and compare to the telecommunications system, which is fully integrated. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And the sum total of all of these problems has resulted in a high rate of carbon emissions, which has led to the crisis that we all recognize. So we have an electric system which is based on large-scale central station power generation. So big power plants, usually in New York, they're in the northern and western parts of the state, and electricity is transmitted through long lines to the urban centers, which is a wasteful and very expensive way to do it. And we have seen a demand by people in communities around New York for what has come to be called energy democracy. People want control over the energy decisions that affect their lives. And this has come to be kind of a political base for renewable energy and clean energy and for energy efficiency. And it has the potential, this distributed energy system, which Chris referred to realize significant savings on utilities' investment into large-scale facilities. We're talking about facilities that cost billions of dollars. So in New York, this is, not sure how visible this is for you. It's not too bad. You had the classic large generators feeding into the utility system, which would then distribute to the customers based on a few large-scale generators. And the grid that we are building is going to consist of many, many distributed generation forms that are renewable, from the solar panels on people's roofs, like Chris's, to small wind farms, to solar farms in rural areas. Offshore wind is beginning to grow in New York and around the country. It's going to be a major contributor. And all of these are feeding into the grid and then being fed back out to customers. And here's an example. This is a Brooklyn Queens demand management program in Brooklyn. And it was started actually out of a process that started with the Hurricane Sandy assessment. And one of the decisions there was that the utility wanted to build a $1.2 billion substation in this neighborhood, which needed more energy than they had. And that would be the traditional utility response. And ordinarily it would be approved by government. But in this sort of post-Sandy crisis mode, and the participation of New York City and many environmental organizations and consumer organizations, the decision was, why don't you try to do something different? See if there's something else you can do. So Con Edison put out basically a request for proposals for 50 megawatts of capacity in this area. And they got something like 200 responses. And some of them were crazy, ramshackle setups like this on people's roofs. And some of them were energy savings proposals. So you could meet your 50 megawatt target by building 50 megawatts of generation, or you could meet it by building some generation and reducing usage sufficiently so that what you have, you use more efficiently. And here, this whole community got engaged in identifying savings, and some of this was kind of small manufacturing. I mean, this was the worst kind of neighborhood to do a project like this. There were no large facilities, no, just get this guy online and that'll fix the problem. But they did get what they needed. And so this is a project where these generators on rooftops in this whole neighborhood had solar installed on the rooftops, and then they share, they're all wired together. So if your roof gets dark at 3 p.m., but mine is west facing, so I pick up sun until 6, you can draw on my rooftop and so on in a whole community, very efficient. And we settle our purchases of electricity from one another using blockchain technology. So this is all run in this kind of little village here with the grass growing and everything, but it's been a success. So it's a bit of a model or a little augury of what might come in the future. So the Rev Vision, this little model is kind of in microcosm. The Rev Vision is take the issue of balancing, which Chris referred to. He was talking about the problem of balancing in a provincial area as opposed to a larger area. And New York is aiming at balancing the renewable resources so that you have wind comes online just when solar is going down. Wind tends to be later in the day, solar tends to be earlier in the day. Then you pull in demand response, so you have small companies or large residential users having technology that reduces their demand, turns your air conditioning temperature up 2 or 3 degrees at a certain time of day, something you will not notice but makes a big difference to the system. And people who have energy efficiency measures, so they have bought more efficient refrigerators and so on. You can mobilize all of these resources in a very dynamic and flexible way, kind of a real-time balancing. And this is made possible by our use of information technology. So, in New York, we call it kind of a step toward the Internet of Things. So your refrigerator is talking to the utility who's talking to your electric car, which acts as a battery for the system when you're not driving it and you have it plugged in. It can be drawn on by the system as a source of energy. And yet all of this balancing of small things can add up to a workable system, and also has, interestingly, a reliability and resilience of its own, so that if part of the system goes down, you might lose 400 families, but you're not going to lose 400,000 families. And there's always some piece of this that can be drawn on, even if it's the usage reduction piece. And California, Germany, and Australia in particular, at this point, that have huge proportions of renewable energy, as China does, have recognized that they're no longer facing the problem of adding solar and wind. They have plenty of solar and wind. The problem is, how do you integrate it into a system that was historically based around central generation and fossil fuels? So key to this is having new uses for electricity, so that if you have excess solar power, instead of curtailing it or turning it off, you can start running, use it for the electric vehicle fleet, or you can sell it to neighboring systems, as you're discussing is on the agenda for China, but is also on the agenda in California, very much so. The more applications for electric usage that can be developed, the more we can build this flexible, interwoven system. So decarbonize electricity and then electrify the economy. So I'm just going to say a word about the use of law and the use of markets, because, and this is really just a question really to you China experts, all of you, about the future in China, because I have studied in New York and Germany, the comparison of New York and Germany, and I think it's an interesting comparison because it's similar in many ways, but New York is really developing a market-based system where prices and terms of service are developed by the regulators, but they then govern the workings of the system. And obviously, cost and price can be a real engine for decarbonizing, where now solar and wind are, in many jurisdictions, the cheapest resource. And my understanding from what you've both said about China is the question is, how does that price or how does that cost factor become a driver in the actual usage of these resources in the system? But New York doesn't have any, has no statute, has never had a statute. There's no New York clean energy law the way there is in Germany and in California, for example. So it is fundamentally a regulatory and market-based project. And that obviously, it has strengths because it's very flexible. On the other hand, it has not produced as robust resources as either the German or, say, the California system has in terms of wind and solar. It also depends on the regulator's willingness to impose harsh penalties on fossil fuel generators, which is always politically difficult. I think it's been politically difficult in the U.S. for very different reasons from the ones you've described in China. And as we see today in the federal programs on climate change, if it's not based in statute, it's very easy to reverse in subsequent political climates. So just my final caution is the market can be a very powerful factor. It's made a lot of good changes in New York. We're seeing powerful changes in the U.S., but I would just caution against over-reliance on the market and refer you to Nicholas Stern's famous book on climate change, and his first sentence of which is, climate change is the greatest market failure the world has ever seen. So you could look at climate change and say this is really, that the market has been the problem, not necessarily the solution. And so I would just urge application of market-based mechanisms with a certain amount of caution. And this is just a reminder of the stakes that are on the table in this project in its largest sense. This is an ice sculpture that was placed by 2 New York sculptors at the beginning of the climate march in 2014. And it's, you may see in the corner, it's right in front of the old Flatiron building in Lower Manhattan, which is where the march started. And so as 400,000 people march by in the course of the day, this sculpture slowly melted until by the end of the march, there was nothing there. So on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So yeah, so I mean, for the record, I have to say, can you guys agree they made the issue of power sector kind of sexy and interesting? Yes? All right. So now that means you must all have really compelling questions. I mean, I have some, wow, I mean, I've got lots of questions. But actually, well, let me just ask one to start us going here that, I mean, because I have so many, but that Eleanor was talking about distributed power. I mean, I love the Brooklyn example, and I think a lot of us know that in the U.S. there's lots of experimentation. Can you guys raise your hand do you guys have any, who has solar panels or some renewable on their roof or connected to their house? Anyone? Oh, okay, speakers in charge here. What about, do any of you control your...
I can check the output on my phone.
Okay, can you control your thermostat with your phone? Yes. Who wants to control the thermostat on phone? I'm looking into it. Who wants to put solar panels? You can put your hands, and then we could all feel better, like, you know. But I know that I live in Maryland, and I know that I'm getting, I think we just switched to one of the, my husband did, I don't know, who knows what's happening with it, but that we are getting more connected to renewable power. But I did like the line that you said, kind of energy democracy, because it makes me realize that what I do matters. I know there was a time here when in the building, I know there's been conversations about the building that those of us that we freeze all the time, we're kind of wondering like, who can we talk to so we can use less energy in our building? Anywho, distributed power issues. So one for Eleanor is that I mean, you gave the example of the kind of eclectic Brooklyn example. Are there other examples in New York where there's maybe kind of is that the only real good example of distributed power in New York City or under the REV, or are there some other good ones that you can tell us about?
I mean, there are many examples. There are many examples. There are microgrids, which are basically, you create the grid. You're still attached to the central grid, but within your community or your industrial facility or your office building or your campus, you may be as a kind of a self-contained unit with the capacity to island or disconnect from the central grid in the case of an emergency. And those are popular models, and they're growing, and there's a lot of incentives for that. There's also the growth of small and medium-sized solar and wind projects throughout the upstate areas, constrained at this point in time primarily by the difficulty in citing some of these projects and some community opposition, kind of a NIMBY movement against solar power and wind power, which is actually proving to make citing these problematic.
Do any methane capture at wastewater or sludge treatment plants in New York? Because I know that's an issue that I've been looking into. I love sludge. We're gonna have a sludge meeting coming up, people, so be ready for it. But because we're doing a project, we're looking at the potential in Chinese cities because they have a lot of sludge. 1.3 billion people times anything is a whole heck of a lot of something. So I'm kind of curious in New York. I know Boston's got some. DC, we capture methane from our wastewater treatment plant sludge. In case you guys didn't know, you were contributing. What about New York? Is that methane capture from these sources
There's some.
growing?
There could be a lot more. And, of course, I think that the federal government just recently has reversed some of the methane rules or canceled the finalization of methane rules. So what we're missing is there is an industry for that, but we're missing any hard regulatory regime or statutory regime requiring it, and I think that's what's needed.
Yeah, but I think that those are methane rules that are mainly for like leaks from natural gas production. But I think that it seems in the U.S. that something like half of all of our wastewater and sludge plants are actually capturing methane to power themselves. So I'll have to come check out the sludge plants in New York next time I go up. So now for the other two, so Chris and Mun Ho, just maybe say a couple things about distributed power, because it was part of your recommendations about maybe just quickly as some obstacles that you two maybe see to distributed power. Is that, talk to me about DP.
Well, let me actually mention a couple of more examples because so that folks know that this is more routine than you think. The city of Austin, Texas, now has 12 million square feet of office, commercial space, condos under control for a district cooling system. And this operates, obviously, if you've been to Austin, you know they have an air conditioning load about 10 months of the year. And what they do is they super cool the buildings during the night, so you're storing cool, sort of like a battery. And then that allows, for more efficient use of the overall system. Where I live in Tacoma, Washington. Bonneville Power has a program now with customers. And actually, before I ask that, this is a question that we ask a lot: is how many gigawatts of electric water heaters do people think there are in the United States? I'm talking about residential things.
Many.
Well, there's a lot more than you think. A lot of people think that, it's all gas. Well,
I know.
It's like
I do know it's the number one source. If you look at water's energy footprint, that's the number one source.
It's something like 50 gigawatts of residential water heating through electric, which is a huge number. And it's also an opportunity. So Bonneville Power, which operates the grid out where I live, has a program now with residential customers where they will pay the customer for the utility to take control of the water heater. And basically, it's the same kind of thing. Your water heater is a battery. You're still getting your shower or hot water, and you're not being scalded, but it doesn't cycle on and off as much. And that's the kind of thing that can sync quite well with wind and solar, to your point. The distributed piece, there's, in the United States, one of the challenges is that we really don't have an energy policy, period.
You all knew that, right? Okay, just checking.
We do not have one. What we have are 50 state energy, or 50 states plus DC, Puerto Rico, et cetera. So the regulation of electricity and energy in the United States is done at the state level. So there are some excellent examples, New York being one of the stars with the REV process, California, but there are also many states that, don't get it. And that has been, who will not be named? And that's been one of the challenges with these issues because unless you can get the economics right, a lot of the incumbent utilities that operate in these states that don't get it feel economically threatened. So you see things like, charges to do a solar study to connect that residential home to the grid. And this even happened in my state 20 years ago, where Northeast Utilities was charging, thousands and thousands of dollars to do an interconnection study. That's because they felt threatened from this distributed energy market. But a lot of states get it, and they recognize, because of the peaky nature of how power is consumed, especially in the cities, that it makes a lot of sense to better connect demand with generation, and to do so close to where that is, so you can get at loads and also integrate better with wind and solar. So I think you're going to continue to see the growth in distributed generation and demand response in states where it's already occurring. California has an excellent DG policy, but it's going to require, on a national level, I think it's going to require much more attention, or maybe states that don't get it saying, well, I think we can figure out the economics, and going through their state proceedings.
So in some ways, I mean, from what you described, I mean, the U.S. is not all that different from China in terms of okay, New York and California are the exceptions, but because you said that a lot of provinces, I remember I had a journalist call me and said, asking me well, why is it that some provinces don't want the renewables? And I said, well, I think it's because they've got coal. I mean, and also that is in China too, is there an issue that if they bring in power from out of state, besides that not generating jobs, that they can't tax it?
Right.
Or charge fees?
Right, it's an economic issue.
It's an economic
Right.
issue.
So if the power generated within a province, the governor, mayor, whatever, can tax that, but they can't tax, or at least they can't now, power that's imported or exported. So it's an economic issue that they need to resolve.
What about in the United States? Because our states will import power sometimes.
Yeah, but it's done at the regional level by grid operators. So you've got the New England grid, which is 6 states. You have the New York grid, which is actually larger than New England because it's a bigger state. And you have, PJM, which is the largest grid. So it's done much more at a regional level. And, there are energy transfers even between grids. I know New York has an agreement with Ontario, for example, and also with New England to share power. And they also operate in joint planning exercises. So there's much more coordination here on a regional level.
I mean, because I've been gently fascinated with the power grid stuff since I started doing these meetings about 6-7 years ago. Because it's like invisible. I mean, most Americans, we have no idea this is going on until it's not there.
I think there is another similarity to the situation you were describing in China of the role of the provinces and the states, which is this question of what happens to the workforce in who were in the, let's say, in the coal industry or the steel industry. And so there's been a lot of work done, a lot of it by labor, on what's called just transition. So what happens to workers in a sector which is really phasing out for mostly economic reasons, and the issue of retraining and the role of unions and so on. But I think that the best work I've heard about that's been done on this is in Germany, where they really are in sort of a continual training process with their labor force and take very seriously transition of workers from one kind of industry to another, which is obviously not a simple problem. You don't go from being a coal miner to operating, the interactive grid on your iPhone without some serious, work. So
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because we're actually just so you all know that on July 12th, a month from now, we're actually having a meeting exactly looking at U.S.-China just transition. We're going to have a woman from Kentucky, a grassroots organization that's been working there. And later on in the year, we're going to bring some folks out from Montana. I mean, evidently, that state, it's our #1 coal producer. A lot of people don't know that. We always think it's West Virginia because they're closer to us. But so I think that it's really fascinating that the U.S. and China are having, there's some similar conversations that are happening on what to do with all those coal miners. And just for the record, China has many more of them. All right, in case you're unsure about that. Mun Ho, you're going to leap in here now?
I actually have some maybe slightly contrarian view about this distributed generation. It is the vision of the future, but I think going from here to there requires some major clever thinking. One small point that I'd like to sort of tease out, when you say it was safe on investment, I like to point out that there's investment in building generators and investment in the grid. Distributed power or bringing in more wind and solar requires a lot more transmission lines. We need a lot more investment in building wires to go to this green future and microgrids, right? As you mentioned, right? For the microgrid to work, you actually have to have wires linking the different solar panels. So that's one thing that we need to spend more money. We are not going to really be saving money going to a green future. The idea of us generating our own solar power and not buying off the grid leaves this big problem that we have to solve. Who is going to pay for these wires? Currently, we pay a certain price for each kilowatt hour, and that money goes partly to the generators and partly to the grid owners. If we break this formula and say we are going to buy half of our own use from our own solar panel and only buy half from the grid, then this formula is not going to work to pay for this grid. So the Chinese some Chinese electrical engineers are all saying, oh, we're going to have this a future where we have distributed. We need then a major reform of how we are going to pay for these wires. We could be, say, a per household charge or something. Like regardless of whether you use 1 kilowatt hour or 500, you have to pay this fixed rate for the wire that you are always guaranteed when the sun is not shining, that you have this power. So a major change is required in the world, even in the advanced United States, in the design of power markets.
Yeah, but thinking with China though, that that's a really hard leap for them to make. I mean, I know because like my background, I started off doing stuff with water, and so even metering water, it's like it's hard for the it was so hard for the bureaucracy of China. The idea, I mean, so they started off with metering big users, and I actually like Chris, when you talk about the 10,000 and 1,000 top high energy efficiency goals. I mean, in the water sector, is similar things. They just have to go big first. I mean, the idea of filtering stuff down all the way to these smaller distributed power, individual user stuff, it's tough for China.
Well, the issue that Mun mentioned is common, in the United States and to China. And what he's really talking about is a principle we call decoupling, where utilities require a certain amount of revenue to maintain the transmission and distribution system, and those costs exist whether they have one customer or 5 million customers, and that revenue requirement has to be met. And then separate from that is the electricity sales. And the United States has had a number of successful states that have decoupled, so the utilities are still meeting their revenue requirements to keep the grid operating, but that their return of investment is not based solely on selling as much electricity as possible. And indeed, we at RAP have just started discussions with Guangzhou on a decoupling pilot there. Southern Grid is more progressive than State Grid.
And smaller.
Yes, but I think it's still bigger than PJM.
Okay, yeah.
It's smaller, but small is relative.
Yeah.
Guangzhou and Guangdong, which I think Guangdong is something like 100 million people, has been receptive to a decoupling discussion with us. So I think there's an appetite for that. There's a recognition, as Mun Ho pointed out, that we've got to get at some mechanisms as we're all transitioning to these new business models that you need to have a stable utility. But there are many ways to achieve that revenue requirement without solely relying on what really is a 19th century business model.
Okay, let's go. I think that they're dangerous, giving enough information out to this audience with great new vocab and the image of energy-saving troops. All right, raise your hand high, and the microphone will come to you. And make sure, just tell us your name and where you hang out during the day, and let's get a bunch of succinct questions in. All right, I'll keep track of you.
Okay, my name is John Topping. I'm at the Climate Institute here in Washington, D.C. About a year and a half ago, January 2016, in Nature Climate Change, a team of
can you put the mic closer to your mouth? I'm sorry, webcast, so
sorry,
we got to be able to hear.
A team of experts at NOAA, led by Sandy McDonald, who at that point headed the leading laboratory, said the best thing you could do for climate change in the U.S. would be to connect the 3 U.S. alternating current based networks, the Eastern Interconnection, the Western Interconnection, and the ERCOT, or the Texas grid, essentially with a high voltage direct current overlay. Interestingly, about 60% of the HVDC in the world has been built in China, although it's not, you know, the systematic system that is proposed here. A number of us, about half dozen environmental groups and same number of colleges and universities have been looking at how we essentially could build such a network that would combine two things, radical decarbonization, you know, the rough up to about 78% of the power sector decarbonization, which becomes more important if you electrify vehicles, but also protection against EMP. Right now, we're extremely vulnerable. In the,
Sir, hold on a sec. I think, is the mic not on?
I'm sorry.
Hold on. He's going to flick the mic on. Hold on. There we go.
Oh, this way, okay,
That's
fine.
what.
It would give protection against electromagnetic pulse attack. For example, North Korea could put a 20 kilowatt, excuse me, a 20 kilo,
Kiloton.
excuse me, 20 kiloton, I'm sorry, a 20 kiloton airburst bomb over Kansas City could take the grid down for an extensive length of time, perhaps as much as a year, causing, you know, enormous devastation, or something like the 1859 Carrington event, a major solar storm event could do that. So by essentially burying burying the grid, grounding it regularly, you could accomplish two things. You know, the security hawks were, you know, very concerned, and all of us, you know, really probably should be concerned about the possibility of a North Korean bomb or a severe solar storm. But we also would end up getting dramatic decarbonization because the ability to essentially cut down the line loss would enable electrons to move readily from Phoenix to Boston and so forth. It would allow you to essentially accomplish a blending of the load there. And of course, in China,
Yeah, so do you have a question?
well, no,
Okay,
the question would be,
Okay, good.
I mean, both of you, several of you have looked at both these areas. You have very different political systems in China from what you have here, but the Chinese have advanced on the making use of the technology and so on here, but they have a different political system than we have. Here, permitting, landowner rights and so forth become important. So that in our study, we've been looking at how you would piggybacking existing rights away. That's less of a problem in China, but both areas, both nations have the potential of doing something that could be greatly beneficial on both counts. And I would wonder if you could reflect on how something like this might apply in either of the situations you'd be familiar with.
Okay. Yeah, let's do, who was the other, there's another question around this table. Let's do one more question. Can you guys do short questions so we can remember? Well, remember that question, people.
I had a,
Own your name, sorry.
this is Jim Baker, and I had a question on a different topic, which we might take up a little later, but that is the question of, given where China is currently in its energy generation and the coal plant decisions and so on, how does this affect the NDCs and the China contribution to the Paris Agreement?
Okay. That's good. And you, sir?
This discussion I've heard, Jeff Price, Blue Wave Resources. Much of the discussion that I've heard kind of defined the central 800-pound panda in the room, but then never got beyond the initial defining of it, which is central station renewable coordination. You have a great deal of overcapacity, as you indicated. How do you dispatch things? It seems to me that China has one disadvantage compared to the U.S. and Denmark, which was mentioned earlier. Here in the U.S., we have abundant natural gas, which can be used in various ways to balance the loads. If you look at the wind belt, for example, you have lots of natural gas reciprocating engines that are being built to balance that. If you look at Denmark, they have a gigantic battery called Norway and its hydro system. What can be done? What's the solution in China? Is there a solution to do that?
Okay, good. So we had three questions. One was about the big transmission lines, about security decarbonization question. Jim Baker asking about the NDCs in Paris related to our topic, and the last one, Denmark. Well, that was your code word, right? The balancing issue of natural gas in the U.S. Okay, pick one of the three.
Okay, well,
Maybe more.
I guess I'm not sure about the first question, so I'm going to focus on the next two. In terms of the balancing area and dispatch and so forth, what really needs to occur is what we would call in the United States integrated resource planning, or as we translate in China, it's called scientific energy planning. Okay. Because currently there are energy planners. They have those job titles, but they're not looking down the road and saying, okay, our electricity load growth is expected to be X. Our 13th five-year plan anticipates, this number of gigawatts of new wind and solar, and we've got this system of coal and other thermal plants. And how can we also look at the increased use of electric vehicles? We know BYD, for example, has electrified all of Shenzhen's buses. They've built thousands and thousands of these a year. That's a trend that's continuing. So, and then of course, we're seeing some demand response pilots in places like Shanghai and Jiangsu province. So that's, to us, that is sort of a necessary step that needs to occur as a precondition to getting at the point that you're making is, and until you can actually have a sense of what the future might look like, it's hard to say, okay, these are all the resources we're going to have, and these are how we're going to be using them. So that's something that we're working on. That's one of our prime missions now, is to move towards IRP type process, and to make sure that when those IRP processes are completed, that they're also synced with air quality and water quality plans. That they recognize that the IRP is a vehicle that can also help China to achieve clean air and clean water. But we're not there yet. I think we've got the foundations for that now with some of these market pieces, and there's a recognition at NDRC with the curtailment project that is just starting out in Inner Mongolia and Gansu province of how they can better use renewables, and I think that will evolve because once China is very good at, once there's a really good model that, all 26 provinces have to do that same thing. So I think once something like that is established as a proof of concept, then it's something that could be used nationally.
Can I just add something
Yeah.
about natural gas, though? If our long-term goal is, let's say, 80 to 90% carbon-free by 2050, which is the New York State goal. I think Washington, D.C. has the same goal. Many states have adopted this goal. It's implicit in the Paris Agreement in many ways. And my own view is that that's inconsistent with increasing our use of natural gas, which, although it's less carbon intensive as a burnt fuel than coal, we're getting bigger and bigger estimates of the amount of methane leakage, especially from fracked gas. So, it's easy to integrate natural gas into a balancing system because it's a very flexible fuel. We're looking for replacements for that by how we use renewables. That's just my own view. And I could say a word about the NDC, unless you'd like to take that.
No, go ahead.
So I don't exactly remember it, but I know it's about peaking the use of coal by 2030 and then reducing. I believe that's the Chinese NDC at this point. So I think, as I understand it, the discussion has been, can we do better than that, or can we peak sooner and start reducing the use of coal sooner? So I think that's consistent with the discussions we've been having here today.
And they will peak sooner.
Sounds that way.
Yeah.
Well, there's some information that some folks are saying that China peaked
That
2
they
years
have
ago. So I think the jury is still out because that's a short-term trend, but there's some positive signs there.
Well, I just make a small note about this DC lines. China has, as you pointed out, actually built a number of these DC lines,
Can you explain, translate that? What lines?
the direct current lines.
Okay, so
as
make sure
opposed-
not everyone's all fluent in power grid yet, all
So
right?
the most of the wires, the big transmission grids, is alternating currents. The decision, however, has been criticized. The state grid has this monopoly, and they are guaranteed a return. That is to say, the electricity prices are set such that they will make money from the investment decisions. And so they have made these big decisions to build a very expensive set of DC lines. And that is being questioned whether that actually make economic sense. But you're right that that in the green future, we do need more transmission from the wind and sun-rich areas of both countries, which are in the west, and we need to transmit it to the east. And so there is that long-term requirement. About the natural gas, that is a good point. I think for the next 2 decades, more natural gas will be much better for China's air quality. And if they have a fracking revolution, it will be very good for them. The goal that Alan talked about, if you think about the next 60, 80 years, then we want to get rid of the gas too. But for the immediate future, cheap gas will be very good for China.
Yeah, but they're importing, I mean,
A lot.
a lot.
Yeah.
And I think everyone in Asia is eyeing our shale gas excess. But I guess one thing in the first question, the question about like the security and decarbonization of a grid, that was did anyone want, I don't know, maybe like in New York, is there, I mean, like is distributed power, is that seen as more secure than these big, I mean, is that a question that people talk about up in New York about?
Of course. And, you know, I mean, every state is very conscious of this. The federal government's very conscious. And New York, because of September 11th, is super conscious about this. So there was I think it was an environmental advocate, maybe about a year ago, rowed his boat past the Indian Point Nuclear Power Station, which is located about 30 miles north of New York City, and got really, you know, basically rowed right up to the plant and then rowed away, simply to make and videoed it, simply to make the point that this was an extremely vulnerable installation. So I think that central station generation has its own vulnerabilities, and they're different from those of distributed generation. So I think there are strengths and weaknesses to each. And the advantage of a distributed system, as I said before, is that large parts of it can be islanded from the central grid. So if there's a major event like a Sandy or a 9/11 that brings down the grid, you have minimized the danger. On the other hand, it's more exposed in a certain sense, although thinking about the guy in the rowboat makes you wonder about what's exposed. So I'm not sure, it's not my field, I'm not sure how all the balances work out, but I can see strengths and weaknesses on both sides.
Okay, I'm going to let this side of the room ask questions, but first to follow up on when you said about vulnerability. Chris, I'm super excited that you actually were talking about the water footprint of the energy sector. And first of all, you noted, and I hope you guys paid attention, that he said that that there was an estimate that you quoted that 12% of all China's water withdrawals are from thermal power now. And that's a lot of it's for cooling, but that also includes, that's the whole supply chain, right?
Right.
Where'd you get those numbers, first of all?
From IRENA, the International Renewable Energy, something that, I have the, it's
Yeah.
in the slide, I've got the.
Yeah,
the source.
because there's a lot of estimates. We estimated a few years ago that it was actually as high as 20. I was just curious where you got those numbers.
IRENA is like the IEA for renewable energy.
Okay, but I also was excited when you said that there's actual studies now in China that if they better integrate the wind and solar, that they could drop their water consumption by the electricity sector by 20%.
Up to 20%.
But you have to, and was that also IRENA, or is, all right.
Yeah.
Is IRENA talking to the Chinese folks on doing this?
That's a fair question.
Yeah, no, because we've been looking into this.
Right, and we, I mean, I've been focused on air quality, on just doing water peripherally, but we see the advantage. I mean, it's, you know, with your own eyes, any place here in China, that there's a tremendous opportunities for water that are just not being
Yeah.
taken advantage of.
Yeah, because North China has very, very little water to begin with, so, all right, good, just had to kind of, but that's another huge risk. We actually, just so y'all know that if you're on our mailing list, in about a week, we'll be putting out a blog post and a translation of a new report by the IPE, the NGO in China that usually does stuff on air and water pollution, but they've created a tool and they did an assessment of 30 Chinese coal industries looking at their water risk. So the report was in Chinese only, and I said, we gotta translate this. So the translation should be coming out in about a week, but also, of course, because no one likes reading long things, we will have a blog post that summarizes it with infographics. Hopefully to entice you to read the long thing, but just want to highlight that because this is one big part of my project over the next year is not just looking at decarbonization, but also, lowering the water footprint of China's energy sector. What are the opportunities? All right, yonder right side of the table, you've been so patient. Molly, we're gonna start here and then move and then catch the other 4 people. We'll start with her, we'll answer her question, then do the other 3.
Thank you. Stephanie Sao with SNL Energy. We're Trade News, and we're under the new umbrella of S&P Global, which used to be McGraw-Hill.
Gotcha.
A lot of company name. But I'm following different power markets across the U.S. PJM and the Midwest grid. MISO is under my umbrella. I'm just curious, what are the next steps in terms of learning from U.S. markets? Is there any of that going on right now in terms of looking at what PJM is doing, obviously what New York has been doing with REV, and I know, Chris, you mentioned ERCOT in Texas, but are there learnings in terms of what you mentioned on wind curtailments? Are there learnings on the REV process in terms of financing renewables and trying to get more of that on the grid? Is there any learning or interaction with a grid like PJM that's serving 65 million people in the U.S. in terms of what they've done on capacity? And I know they've been doing a lot on reforming their markets as well. So thank you.
So the learning from U.S. for China. Have you been a matchmaker on that? The eHarmony for grids?
So there's a lot of interest in China about capacity markets, and we are trying to be very nuanced about this. You mentioned ERCOT. ERCOT does not have a capacity market. They just have energy payments, and they do quite well. One of the concerns about having a PJM or an ISO New England type of capacity market is that there's a threat that it might reward, the incumbent generators more than it should. And that could be a detriment to, doing the kinds of clean things that we want. So we have been trying in our conversations with our Chinese colleagues to move them along towards planning, as I mentioned, but not to automatically look at the bright, shiny object of, we need 4 capacity markets. That you might get there at some point, maybe, but first I think we need to look at, overall planning, and they certainly need some sort of an energy type of payment. But we're not, and we still aren't recommending that, China just look at that, although many people are, and you will see that. One thing that I would say that China can learn from the United States, though, getting to capacity markets, is that both ISO New England and PJM, and I don't know if New York does or not because I've been focusing on China the last few years, but I know both of those have payments for energy efficiency resources that you can bid in blocks of energy efficiency, whether it's an entire state's efficiency program or different projects, and be paid, and that's a way to diversify and get more reward for those systems. That would also, we think, be a way to look at more energy efficiency in China. Right now, the obligation is quite small. It's 0.3% per year for energy savings to the grid company. To put that in the U.S. context, that is about the same as the state of Oklahoma achieves. And the best state, like Massachusetts and Vermont, are achieving north of 2%, close to 3%. So we think China can actually do 10 times better than that. And looking at first, ramping up to those higher levels and then doing some sort of system that would, further reward that by actually requiring those resources to perform could be also quite useful going ahead as China moves to a market.
Any of you have something to add?
I would just add that Germany recently.
Mic a little bit closer.
I would just add that Germany recently decided not to form a capacity market, and I think it would be worth looking into the reasons why they did that.
Okay, so now the mics over here, Molly. Why don't we'll go from back to front. We'll gather these 3 questions. So stand up so we can see you, sir. You're way back
Thank
there.
you very much. So my name is Lin Ji. I'm from Energy Blockchain Labs, and we are working on applying blockchain and financial technologies to green finance worldwide. And we have some partnerships with institutions like China Central Bank, MIT, and so on. So I'm very interested in what Ms. Stein mentioned, that New York State is trying to introducing blockchain into the green grid. And can you explain more in detail? And another question is for all of you. That's what do you think? What role will financial technology play in green finance? And thank you.
Yeah. So, Eleanor, do you want to give some answer? And then afterwards, you guys definitely need to talk more deeply, because it sounds like you have lots of questions.
I'll just say, I knew that somebody would take the blockchain bait. I'm glad you did. Unfortunately, I really have very little information about it myself. It's not my field. But we can talk later, and I can suggest some sources for you. It really was this initiative to use that didn't really come from the state. It was really came out of the proposals from this community for how to substitutes for a 50 megawatt substation, and so the origin was the Brooklyn artisanal community came up with this mode of finance. I will say that if you take the sort of the REV vision to its ultimate, it does depend on real-time settlements, real-time financing, and on use of information technology at the local level to really work. So I think in this particular pilot or demonstration project, that was part of it. It's a very long way from being adopted on a larger scale in New York. But if this is being very closely watched, and if it turns out to be successful, I think it could very well be massified.
Some other answer for his other question, the financing? No? Okay. All right, keep moving up the table here, Molly. I will gather these 2 next.
Would you like me to stand up? Or?
Sure,
Okay.
that's what I can see you better up here. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Couple-Parrish. I work with the U.S. Commerce Department's Office of Energy and Environmental Industries. And I just wanted to ask the panelists to talk a little more about the regional cooperation that China is engaging in to improve its grid and the issues that were talked about. And if not, whether or not you guys see potential in increasing cooperation.
Okay.
If I could clarify, when you say regional cooperation, do you mean between different regions of China, or are you talking about between
like
China and other
countries, like regional cooperation between countries in East Asia?
Yeah. And then pass the mic to your neighbor, who's been oh so patient.
Hi, I'm Terry Mahoney. My question had to do with a little bit of clarification. What a great education on the differences between the United States and the Chinese economies. Yeah. So they have right now sort of a field of dreams venture capital market. Like stuff, they have an umbrella sharing Uber kind of company. But that seems to have bled over into the green energy market. And one thing that struck me from what you said, Mr. James, was that they have excess and that it's pretty much lying dormant in this. And how much is that? How is that? That's hard for me to wrap my head around as an American, just sort of getting into understanding the Chinese economy. How does the nature of the Chinese economy, separated as it is into different provinces, how is that really going to impact this moving forward in words that someone who understands the American economy can understand?
Okay. Do you want to? We got
Go for it.
2?
Yeah, we got
Okay.
2.
Well, I mean, what I mentioned on the power sector also applies to apartments and commercial office space. Any American or European who visits, any Chinese city for the first time will be struck by the large amount of vacant office space that exists. And vacancy rates in Beijing in some districts are higher than that of Flint, Michigan, and that is perfectly okay. I had a friend who was a printer. He brought over a 19th century block letter press from Kentucky, and he had a little business to make wedding invitations. And he was trying to find office space in Chaoyang, one of the more expensive districts. And he was going around all these buildings, and they were charging $3,000 a month and up for rent, even more than United States. And he couldn't get them to budge on price because they figured, well, we're just going to sit it out and wait because we know that we'll get our price eventually. So there's much more of a long-term philosophy. It's not a quarter-by-quarter shareholder-driven profit incentive like there is in the U.S. It's much more of a long-term focus. And I think that's probably a big thing to understand just in some of these capacity discussions. Another is that the economic incentives are not aligned properly when you have people building new coal plants that aren't run, and that's okay with the governor or mayor because they're getting an incentive on the construction of that plant and for people building it, but they don't really care if it operates or not. In terms of, though, solving this, I would take, Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang and at their words, and also look at the commitment, the Paris commitment, as well as the 13th five-year plan commitment. The political consequences of China not improving its air quality would be significant. You have a growing middle class. You have people, as we know, sending money out of the country. These are very well known, within China. And you have a situation where improving air quality is discussed like Americans discuss football scores. I mean, you go into a cafe and you hear AQI, AQI, everybody's got the app on their iPhone. And it's like, okay, I'm not sending my kid to school today because the AQI is 400. AQI is air quality index. So the question then is how to harness this increased attention in a way that doesn't, result in, political unrest. And that's kind of the long-term management piece. So I think what I'm seeing now coming out in these pilots is, I mentioned the one in Inner Mongolia and Gansu that have 35% wind curtailment is, okay, what can we do to, use these resources more effectively? And they're looking at, in some cases, the conclusion would be one that an American or European would not necessarily come up with, and that is, well, we're just going to shut down the factory in Beijing and move it to this other area as a way to suck up some of the electricity. And indeed, that's happening in some areas. But, I think they're looking for some short-term solutions to this. Another solution I've heard is sort of a Texas-style thing. Those of you familiar with Texas know that a couple of utilities have like free electricity after 9 o'clock at night. And there's some discussion in China that, well, maybe with this excess, we should get away from this policy of, only having the district heating or district cooling on at certain times a year and allow people to control their own temperatures. And a way to do that would be to, suck up some of that renewables and allow people to heat their homes before November 15th so they're not all sitting around freezing.
Or maybe people just south of, do you guys know that just south of the Yangtze River? I happened to live in Changsha for a year in 1987, which is basically Chicago weather. And officially, we weren't supposed to have heat. So you had to, because you're south of the Yangtze River. So that could also help. It's further away from the major renewable energy, supply, but still, but it's connected, right?
Yeah.
Shanghai is connected to those renewable farms, right?
Right. And then just to close, I think somebody mentioned the Ruhr Valley experience in Germany. That's something that we've talked about quite a bit with our Chinese colleagues, that Germany is a real example of successful economic transition, and that China should look at that example as a way to also move, okay, like it's okay to shut down these old steel plants or old coal plants if you've got a way to move those folks into jobs and they don't just end up, demonstrating against your government.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're also seeing that just recently that the Europe and China are coming closer together for climate cooperation. So maybe, even though the Germans have been pretty intense in their cooperation there. I have a question. I pulled up your slides again because, talking about, I had to look at the pilots where it was about that initial energy conservation dispatch pilots. And I was just realizing, because you were talking, because Chris, you were just talking about, the wind curtailment. And I was looking at, well, none of these provinces are where the wind and the solar, I guess. So this was to focus on the provinces that were supposed to be consuming it. I mean, there's the hydro provinces here. I mean, the Sichuan and the Yunnan and the Guizhou. Are any of these provinces, this is from Mun Ho and maybe Chris, are any of these provinces kind of at the cutting edge of, I guess you said Guangdong, Chris, in terms of trying to push forward green dispatch?
We've had, yes. I mean, I mentioned the discussion we had in Guangdong in the spring, just a couple of months ago about
balancing,
decoupling and that sort of a thing. So, and the folks in Jiangsu are also quite progressive. Their energy-saving troops are very good, and they also get the air quality piece.
Yeah.
The challenge has been, it's kind of a pogo problem. As an air quality regulator, you used to think that, well, if we could just get these energy regulators to do what we wanted, everything would be fine. And we realize, actually, it's air regulators themselves that don't, that are not integrating these clean energy things. And that's indeed what we have found in Jiangsu, where we talk with the energy folks, and they're like, oh, yeah, we get it. These things, we know they're saving carbon. We know they're cleaning the air. But because of the pressure that's being put on the air agencies to achieve quick success, there's sort of a I've got too much information right now, so it's trying to get folks together to understand the economic benefits that would be realized as well as the ability to clean the air.
Yeah, Mun Ho, can you tell us any more about? I mean, because I know any of these provinces that you see that could be doing green dispatch soon, besides maybe Jiangsu.
Guangdong is sort of the richest and the most powerful and the most advanced, and they actually import 1/3 of their electricity. Yeah. I guess not as much as Shanghai, but so they are advanced in that they are rich and their power plants are relatively efficient. But they still have this problem that they say, well, we really don't like to import electricity. Yeah. We like to use our own things, and the electricity contracts are not set up. Say, I will buy this amount of hydropower. I think it's set up that I will buy this amount of power. And Yunnan, if there's suddenly no water, they would have to burn coal in Yunnan to deliver on the contract.
Yeah, which happens.
It has this sort of a complication. So, so this sort of top-down rule instead of market-based environmental policy may not be so good.
Yeah. Well, one thing when you mentioned Yunnan, I think the question you had about regional cooperation. I know that, and this also kind of makes my head hurt. The hydropower that there's talk that, that Yunnan wants to sell hydropower to Southeast Asia because they could make more money than selling it to Guangdong. It's kind of. I feel like it's like kind of like you ever see those old guys on the street, they're playing chess and there's all the people around them moving, telling them how to move their pieces. I feel like the electricity grid, there's not a lot of coordination in what could happen. Like again, hydropower is supposed to be the green saving grace of China's, power grid, right? One of them.
Logical economic sense because the state planners control their price that they sell to Guangdong. But if they can export to Burma or whatever,
they don't
that
control
would be
it.
a market
Yeah.
price.
Okay, do I have any more questions over here? Okay, these two on the side here. Oh, and you've been, I was like, didn't see that hand shooting up earlier there, James. All right, we'll gather these three up and this will be closing us out.
Hi, my name is Julia. I'm sponsored by AICHE, the American Institute of Chemical Engineers, and I'm working on a policy research project on modernizing the U.S. grid and looking at incentives for accelerating the adoption of smart grid technology. So I was wondering, given China's large geographic region and varied climate, does that lend itself to a more regional-based electricity system? And can policies be implemented in a top-down way that apply all across China, or does this really need to be unique to each region of China?
Okay. And then pass the mic over to Bob. Bob had a question.
I'm Bob G. I'm an energy consultant, and I have my feet superficially planted in energy and utility matters, both here as well as in China. I have a very short observation and then a question. I've seen China go through fits of what I call rational exuberance over particular energy technologies and opportunities. About 3 or 4 years ago, there was irrational exuberance over the potential development of shale gas. Last year when I was there, they were talking about how EVs were the next big thing. And so I wonder, when I hear discussions about potential solutions for the vexing, very complicated solutions in China, where people come up with, potential opportunities and solutions, how well those types of avenues would actually be integrated and operationalized in China. That's just a comment. The question I have is, and I think maybe Christopher and Mun, you might be able to address this. There has been a lot of discussion, as you know, about moving away from a state-owned system more to a privatized system, particularly in trying to introduce more market concepts into the energy and utility ecosystem of China. We had the third plenum announcement a while back where the central government did indicate that there was a preference towards lesser reliance on state-owned enterprises to own new and operate new assets, not just in energy, but across the board. What do you think would be the long-term prospects of that actually happening in the energy and utility sector, given that there are efforts still underway, as far as I know, to move in that direction, although not with let's just say, limited measures of success?
Okay. Why don't you answer those two, and then we'll get to James real quick.
Let me answer that state ownership. So that remark in the state plenum about relying more on market forces has been noted very much. But the actual thing that we have seen over the last few years is that there's very little movement. And that is what I think make this a very different animal from the US, that the state-owned enterprises own a majority of the coal assets or the electrical assets and the oil refining assets. And the major power users, the steel companies, are also state-owned companies. So that makes an introduction of a market somewhat of a very different animal, right? That ultimately there are some party boss deciding what is best for the party, for the province. And they, through their ownership of all these enterprises, would make a non-market decision. And that makes this reform process, I think, very complicated.
But I know, but like Shenhua and some of these big Shenhua, the world's largest coal company, they're also investing more in wind and solar. And so I don't know, I feel like I want to be optimistic about that.
No, but I think that is from a top-down order. You say we want more windmills, right? But they haven't figured out the way to actually use it. So that's right. There's all these top-down orders and things happen, right? We go to the moon, we build all these mills, the wind turbines, but we don't know how to use it.
We don't interconnect.
Yeah. An interconnect, yeah. And for the woman on the side asked about the smart grid,
Regional grid or
stuff, yeah.
Well, I mean, you have the two companies. You have Southern Grid and State Grid. Southern Grid has been much more interested in looking at these issues of having larger balancing areas, renewable integration, demand response, those kind of things. State Grid has been somewhat. They've had like two main messages. On the one hand, when they go, to European or United States, they talk about let's have one global grid. It's kind of consistent with the one belt, one road policy. But then within China, they have been pretty opposed to looking at, anything more than the existing balancing areas. And state grid is pretty powerful. So I think it is going to require someone or some agencies at the central government to basically direct this to occur. It could also be, and this is one of the reasons that we're looking at Southern Grid, is if we can get some, a pilot and some demonstration to sort of ease any discomfort that state grid might have, and show a possible path forward that would enable them to consider this. But I think initially it's going to be, it's going to be a challenge to do that type of thing that you're questioning about in state grid, and I would be more looking at what's happening in the Southern Grid territory.
And to close house, so James, you have to talk to him individually because I got to add something here. What about, Xi Jinping, he talked about, remember when a couple of years ago when he first made his CO2 reduction commitment, one thing that a lot of people didn't catch, but I was excited about, he talks green dispatch, but he also talked about the CO2 emissions trading. I mean, will that be kind of a catalyst for pushing forward some of these reforms too?
Yes, and the key there is to define at the government level, what do you mean by green dispatch? And that hasn't happened yet. We've been trying to help define that ourselves with the figuring, first mover. Okay, we're the first out of the gate. Maybe we're not absolutely correct, but this is what we think green dispatch is.
Okay. So it sounds like I'm going to have more meetings on the power sector in China to get our brains around it. So James, you have to ask him one-on-one because I want to be honest and end on time because most of you were here at the start time. So want to applause one more time for my speakers here. And I want to thank the Energy Foundation, Climate Works, and Luce Foundations, that they're the ones supporting my work looking at water and energy nexus issues. And also want to note, remember July 12th, we're going to have that coal energy transition meeting on U.S. and China. Don't miss it. Thank you so much.